everyone. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Gladys Rama. I'm the editorial director, and I'm so pleased to be moderating our first session as well as welcoming you to our summit today. It's called the Hybrid Cloud Security in 2023 Summit. It's been brought to you by Okta, Red Hat, 1111 Systems, and Metallic, a Commvault venture. The editorial staff here at RedmondMag.com, Virtualization and Cloud Review, and AWSinsider.net have worked really hard to bring together some of the best experts on this topic for this event, so we really hope you enjoy it. Before we start today's event, the first of 3 sessions today, we do have a couple of announcements. First, this event is being recorded and it will be available for future viewing, so you'll receive an email from us when the replay is available, generally within the next couple of days. Second, each of today's 3 sessions will be followed by a 5 to 10 minute Q&A. So as questions occur to you during the sessions, please be sure to put them into the Q&A area of your console, and we'll get to as many of them as we possibly can. During today's third session, we are giving away a DJI Mini 3 Pro drone, but you have to be present to win, so be sure to stay on for the entire event. And finally, we have a bunch of resources for you from our sponsors, Okta, Red Hat, 1111, and Metallic. They're available on the console for you right now. So please do download those and check them out. It's because of our sponsors underwriting this content that we can bring you the summit. So we thank them for sponsoring today's event and supporting the community, and we ask you to check out those resources so we can bring you more events like this in the future. Now, the first session of today's summit is a great one. It's called Top Hybrid Cloud Security Threats Heading into 2023, featuring a frequent speaker here. If you've attended, if you're a repeat audience member, you've probably heard him speak before. Ian Thornton-Trump, he's the Chief Information Security Officer for Cyjax Limited in the UK, and the Chief Technical Officer of Octopi Managed Services in Canada. Ian is an ITIL certified IT pro with 25 years of experience in IT and IT security. From 1989 to 1992, he served with the Canadian Forces Military Intelligence Branch. In 2002, he joined the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserve and retired as a public affairs officer in 2013. After a year with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police as a criminal intelligence analyst, Ian worked as a cybersecurity analyst and consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare verticals. Today, he's the CISO for Cyjax, as I mentioned, and the CTO for Octopi. He has deep experience with the threats facing small, medium, and enterprise businesses. His research and experience have made him a sought-after cybersecurity consultant specializing in building security operations, working as a virtual CISO, and sharing his passion for building effective cyber threat intelligence programs for small, medium, and enterprise organizations. Ian, we're looking forward to today's session from you, so the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Gladys. It's great to be back on the first one of the new year, where we get to talk about all sorts of really, I think, neat subjects with this whole kind of expanse of all the different things that we get into with the team, with Gladys's team and Victoria, and I just want to thank them so much for having me back. I'll be making a few more appearances this year to be sure. Now, I am very excited, and there I've got the cast from Moulin Rouge to help me celebrate the kickoff to 2023, a look at the top hybrid cloud security threats. Oddly enough, in this presentation, we're not going to really be talking too much about actual bad guys, because interestingly enough, the actual bad guys, are a small part of a larger business problem when we talk about hybrid, right? Now, there's a lot of confusion about the meaning of hybrid. We're going to get into that, because what you might believe is a hybrid cloud deployment that involves multiple clouds or your own infrastructure, your own TIN, and a relationship that it could be front end is in the cloud, the back end is on premise, or vice versa, or in a lot of cases, the support of that hybrid infrastructure is done through auxiliary services, even software APIs. So the focus that I'm taking on this in terms of the cloud security threats is like the risk to the business and a little bit less around the technical risk, although that will make an appearance, and we will certainly have a discussion on that subject as well. Strap in. I think you're going to really enjoy this, but the first thing we need to really do is talk about architecture. And this is an area where there is a lot of ambiguity about what that exactly means within organizations, and that lends itself to the, whose responsibility are things. So we're certainly going to get into that kind of depth of the discussion, but I also want to kind of say that hybrid has kind of like this nuance to it, that it's something that will bring great value to an organization, and that it, is being advertised as sort of the way forward, And I can see that. However, the hybrid experience for many organizations has been difficult and painful, and I'm going to be incorporating a lot of lessons learned into this presentation from where I see the major sort of flying debris of a hybrid deployment or operationally, or where parts of the business are only too happy to embrace software as a service or some other created thing, and only to have it kind of fall apart. So that's like, I think one of the more sort of serious notes on this is when we talk about this type of deployment, we're really talking about a combination of on-premise infrastructure or private cloud with a public cloud, right? And then the idea being here that hybrid allows for that data and even applications themselves to move between the two environments, keeping in mind there's going to be codependencies along all of this, from infrastructure that you buy or infrastructure that you own, right up to those SaaS endpoints that perhaps have an API relationship to some application that you're running as the front end that backs into everything from ERP to Salesforce to what have you. So ultimately, one of the areas that becomes the most difficult area and I would say the vital ground is the connectivity, the redundancy, and the network layer. The house has to be in order to do anything within the hybrid architecture with solid network support. And network support is not just the guy looking after the Ciscos anymore, or just the person configuring the firewall. The network, when I'm talking about this here, is your network, the egress and ingress points into the cloud, and then, of course, the virtual networking that needs to take place within the cloud. So the first kind of takeaway from this hybrid issue that you're going to be facing is you need to be comfortable working in a virtual world and virtual networking, as well as the traditional on-premise firewall, load balancers, and all of that stuff that those incredibly surly people deal with on a regular basis in the NOC. Okay, so this in itself is one of the key takeaways from this presentation, is the network house has to be in order for all of this to work properly. Now, I will get into, some of the other issues around that, around latency and what kind of impact that can have, and how sometimes you can reuse the tin that you have in order to leverage auxiliary services rather than having to run those and or on-premise and or in the cloud. So again, really, really important to have that networking house in order before we go there. Because ultimately we have two sort of threat models. One from VMware that really talks about a zero trust model using like next generation technology. So some of it is built into your cloud platforms. Other things need to be configured. Other additional services need to be provided. But here we see a couple of different kind of issues when it comes to the high-level security threats. So the first is getting your zero trust model wrong, allowing stuff that shouldn't be in a zone, in a secure zone, global access. This is bad. And this can happen so easily because of the second threat, where we look at API top 10 from OWASP, okay? Now, this is where it really gets blurry between apps that are cloud deployed and in a hybrid environment, right? This model really is easy to comprehend when your entire application is delivered via the cloud. But when you have other services that hang off on present infrastructure or other public clouds for whatever reason, right? Maybe you find it less expensive to ship logging data over to an S3 bucket as opposed to paying for it in Azure, okay? So there are a lot of use cases and business cases that call for like some services to show up in Amazon and other services to run from your Azure platform. All of this needs to be managed. And in a lot of modern environments, you could have virtual infrastructure in the cloud, you could have virtual infrastructure on-premise, and both are dependent on those auxiliary services. And we see the auxiliary services along the bottom, which include your AD and identity and access management, NTP, so everything is synchronized, DHCP, so everything gets an IP address, DNS, so that you can find everything on your network. And increasingly important, and the single point of failure in many organizations, is certification management, okay? Now, I want to call this one out specifically because this is where everything can stop working because the organization hasn't invested the necessary diligence and or training in the certificate management issues required for running enterprise-level applications. In fact, you know, if you're not on top of this, everything else may not matter. Okay, so this becomes a critical aspect of this zero trust model, and making sure that in order for the customer experience or even the safety and security of sensitive data or financial data, that your certificates are in place and properly functional within the organization. Critical aspect. The second area of security threats can be really lumped into are problems with APIs. Now, I put Sijax, the company that I have up there, because imminently we're going to be releasing some open source intelligence work that we've done on public APIs and how they can potentially expose sensitive information. So I'm really excited about that report. That report should be coming out, I'm going to say, by the end of the month. But when we look at the OWASP issues, and in cloud and hybrid deployments of applications specifically, this is where we end up, because the route in for the bad guys into the architecture and into the server aspect comes from those issues around code development, and applications that are now increasingly a subset of APIs that build the actual application itself. This is where we see organizations pushing for the efficiency and orchestration and automation parts that Zero Trust brings at the application layer, where, for instance, you know, as just an easy example, you're running things like CyberArk, you're running things like SailPoint, you're running things like Active Directory within your organization, but you want to automate the privileged access. You want to automate the onboarding experience and auto-provision a bunch of stuff. This all happens as a result of writing a lot of bespoke code and API function calls within possibly several SaaS or even your own on-premise stuff, because you may have stuff that doesn't integrate, right? That there is no connector for when you're talking about bringing together a whole bunch of business systems and trying to derive an efficiency to your workflow out. This is where it falls off the rails, and this is why increasingly the skill sets around networking and application development in the cloud and auxiliary service management becomes the three tiers, if you like, and that if any of those are not really at, I'm going to be honest here, a world-class level, or you have enough compensating controls in front of it, the hybrid experience can be like the Uber Prius there that's on fire. And that is the simple kind of architectural truth behind this, right? Now, there is more, though, because there's a bunch of compliance stuff that was easy, I would say easier to manage at the enterprise level when you had visibility on where that data exists and what sort of, I would say, where the burden of security is more focused on a third party or a provider than it is on your own organization. So as an example, right, meeting regulatory and data sovereignty requirements, there are countries, Germany, Saudi Arabia, other countries, that have specific issues around transferring personal or sensitive data to other countries like America, right? And there has to be a number of different sort of challenges here. One is, of course, setting up your company in a way where they can do data transfers between the two entities, or somehow virtually firewalling or controlling the actual sensitive data from being available in the countries where it shouldn't be available. And this is a huge issue coming at us with the increasing sort of dialogue between Max Schrems, who you may or may not know is sort of like the guru, if we can say that word, of data protection in the UK and in the EU, especially when it comes to data sharing agreements. And even though a new data sharing agreement has been stood up between America and Europe and the UK, whether or not that meets a legal test will be determined in 2023. And the last times we've done this, it's kind of fallen apart. And in fact, we're into a really weird suggestion right now that even though it's been agreed that model contracts or standard contractual clauses within a data sharing agreement are not acceptable. However, the Irish court has not offered a solution to that problem. So we're now at this position where we're doing something that at any moment could be kind of struck down, and we need to figure out, okay, well, if we can't do standard contractual clauses and we can't do model contracts, how are we going to share data, especially when it comes to large providers? And this is where private clouds now become an important aspect. And who knows where this will go, folks, because I don't have the crystal ball to figure out what the decision-making process is. But, suffice it to say, not all eggs in one basket are acceptable to some jurisdictions. Okay. And again, when I look at the scaling of a web app, it's not really a technology problem. It's a human communication problem. And again, security controls can only control, not stop the bleeding, right? So we're in the situation where it is much more expensive to remediate something that is in a hybrid cloud model and is being delivered on a global scale than it is when you had it on premise and you could touch it. So there is a visibility issue here that is really, really important. And some of our partners, especially I want to call out 1111, they will assist in understanding the architectural requirements that you have and matching that up to these are the types of services that you may require. And those services may come from our other partners as well, and we will be sending a shout out to them shortly in this presentation. So this is the other major issue that we have, and I think it's really coming to a forefront. Now, I always like to throw a little bit of global climate change in front of everyone who works in IT because, we're into a situation where there's more storms, more temperature variables. I was home in Canada for Christmas and really enjoyed that minus 41 degrees centigrade. And that minus 40 anything, it's pretty much the same temperature in Fahrenheit as it is in Celsius. but at minus 41 degrees, a lot of trouble can occur with the grid, especially during storms, especially during high load, and all of these type of things. And of course, we saw the infrastructure damage that many of the storms inflicted on Buffalo. My heart goes out to those people, the folks in Northern California who are suffering as well. All of this physical infrastructure disruption can really affect the architectures that you've chosen. You know, everyone knows now that servers in the basement of flood-prone areas is a terrible idea, right? As is being reliant on a single point of contact when you're in a hybrid mode where you're delivering an application where the information that supports the delivery of that application is interrupted. And how will you be able to continue? What is your plan? What is the DR BCP that you're doing, right? And because I said the word DR, I got to give a shout out to Commvault or Metallic Commvault, one of our sponsors, because this is an area that is going to be emerging and is going to be more of a risk as we find that the infrastructure is fragile when faced with massive, winter storms or spring flooding. Right. Now, I said architecture is the vital ground, and this is really where the security of your organization and your application development, that organization is going to support the generation of revenue, the crown jewels, as it were, comes under increasing scrutiny by threat actors. And this is why, now, I'm not calling out these as separate jobs, that every company out there needs to have an enterprise of software and an infrastructure architect. But these roles, if you will, these services that are provided to the business, might be a better way to put it, are the critical path to success when you're talking about hybrid, when you're talking about building applications and taking advantage of your own infrastructure that you own and the cloud for that scalability and availability piece that you might be missing. So this is where there's three critical pieces that need to come together when you're talking about delivery of hybrid cloud. And that is finding the solution to support the organization's business strategy, making sure that the software development team and the business are aligned on expectations and deliverables, right? And then an infrastructure person that knows both worlds, the physical world and that virtual world, and that perhaps even commands a DevOps or a DevSecOps team for the organization. And it actually, I would say, from all three of them have to be working with GRC for risk, because the choice of providers, the choice of services, becomes really important. There can't be any ambiguity about who's going to patch the Exchange servers in your organization. At least you think that it's being done for you by a managed service provider, but in fact it turns out in the case of Rackspace it wasn't done, and that might have been a poor decision for an organization, right? So it's really, really important that not only are these service functions available to your organization, and if they're not, that's okay, but you've got to find them somewhere. So that might be consulting, that might be, an MSSP that'll come to your rescue, those are an MSP that'll come to your rescue that is comfortable working in that hybrid cloud environment and understands the different controls that are available to deal with the vulnerabilities that may be present. Okay, so moving from architecture, we want to move into the hosting platforms themselves, right? Now, Azure, Amazon, other hosting providers have got a great graphic that brings this up and makes it really, really clear. But there are so many different things available within these platforms. And both AWS and Azure don't really go to great excruciating detail, and they keep changing the names on some of these things. So depending on what platform that you have, you need to be really careful about understanding everything from what licenses you need to purchase in order to enable certain functions within the organization. And of course, from the customer perspective and customer experience perspective, you may need to consider different modes, for instance, of authentication for customers, either single sign-on if you're a B2B relationship, or a B2C relationship where you want to enable multi-factor authentication because you're awesome and believe in data security, and how that is achieved is through protection of identities and access to that application to protect customer data. And then, of course, there's Google Cloud, which, to be fair, I don't know much about, to be fair. I understand it's really swoopy, which is great, but this is, again, I think Google Cloud and Kubernetes kind of go hand in hand. So if your sort of strategy is around leveraging Kubernetes and leveraging Google Cloud, that's totally cool, but it remains the same that you need a number of different services in order to compensate for the lack of security controls that might be present in the original hybrid designs that you have. And this diagram really pulls it together. And I threw up Metallic there and 1111 Systems, and of course Red Hat, one of our key sponsors for these, in that on-site, all of the responsibilities are yours, going all the way up to SaaS, where the service provider manages and all the different steps in between. So infrastructure, platform, and then SaaS itself. Now, keep in mind that even though you might have everything in you that you manage locked down and that everyone is like really dialed in and you've got all the visibility, you have almost no visibility on behaviors and logging and even what the best practices are going on the SaaS platform. So if you look at this as green, things that you have to manage and governance and risk needs to apply there, underlying that is the red stuff, which is somebody else's responsibility. And I'm saying, as you go up this stack, you're going to want to make sure that everyone is dialed in and that you have visibility, T's and C's, and indemnification. So that's where, when you're talking about a SaaS application, you got to bring in legal. You got to look at the terms and conditions. Are you going to even help us if, we think there's a problem? If we're investigating data breach in a SaaS system, can we get access to logs? What's your backup strategy, et cetera? All of these questions have to be asked. Especially if the SaaS application pulls in a number of different on-premise APIs as well as data from other systems that you might have in place. The level of complexity of a modern SaaS application is absolutely astounding. As soon as it becomes less standalone and more integrated into the workflow of your business. So truly, if I was going to say if there's one takeaway slide here that you want to, screen cap or whatever, take this one. Red Hat put it together and really understand, the areas of the red have to be risk addressed, right? I think that's probably one of the key security threats heading into 2023 is for those things that are more reliant on a service provider, are you addressing those risks? Are you comfortable from an operational perspective with the level of risk that's being provided by that particular provider? So again, we now go back to the issue. Bruce Schneier, back in, I think it was in the 80s, he said the worst enemy of security is complexity. Hybrid is complex. Hybrid involves multiple things. They all have to work together. Some of it you have complete responsibility for. Some of it you may have no responsibility for. But again, it's all risk. And I like to say if the data is inside the organization and it should not be, that's going to be a problem because that means information that customer needs or wants isn't available. And then, of course, if the data is outside the organization and it should not be, that's also a problem. So, for instance, like if you're able to enumerate other user accounts by incrementing a address or at the end of a URL, that's going to be a problem. That's like basic level stuff. But unless that's caught, many of these systems can make their way into production. Many of them today, the amount of SQL injection that you see out there attacks, is huge, right? And again, this is where that experience, that consulting, that managed service provider that specializes in securing cloud, that's where they come to the table, because what we don't want you to do is start disabling security to make it work so you can say, yeah, we delivered it, even though it's completely insecure. That's a terrible idea. So when I look at the threats, now that I've sort of given a preamble here and I've said, where do the threats really lie, right? The threat has to have a threat actor associated before it turns into an exploit, right? It has to have those vulnerabilities in place before it can be exploited. So a lot of this comes down to the fundamental fact that the IT team is under-resourced. It is not equipped to deal with the level of complexity, right? You simply don't know what you are doing when it comes to this, right? This is where you need to send up the flare, seek information from your peer network, and figure it out what your plan is. And this is a complex deal when you're dealing with both stuff in the cloud and then dependencies within your own organization. Vendor relations are critical at this point, right? Your security team has no programmers. Increasingly, as I pointed out, my main argument for this is that the security team needs to be integrated into the SDLC, into the secure software development lifecycle. Pretty important here. This is because there needs to be a common dialogue. This is where you see a lot of the business arguments for a DevSecOps function within your organization, is to start building that comfort level of security being applied to the programmatic stuff that is being done based on the assumption that your application is made up of all sorts of APIs building that application. Conversely, the development team has no security people. You want a quick win? You want secure applications? Start working with the development team and gamify or make it interesting to have discussions about, hey, here's some things that we want to do from a programming perspective. Like, we want to change languages, so we're using a more friendly language when it comes to programming. Or we want to look at, the common vulnerabilities that we see in web applications or APIs, and we want to start testing for it. Other issue, which is so fundamental but so overlooked, is understanding who the business owner is within the organization when you're looking at the assets that make up that function. These are other things where the CMDB becomes really, really important. Encryption, I'm going to say it's a double-edged sword. It is a solution in some cases, but it also can be part of a problem. We'll get into that a little bit. Also, compliance. This is an issue that's going to come more and more as more data regulations, follow on, including, building on the tremendous work that California has done in terms of consumer protection. Compliance is coming at us in 2023 like you wouldn't believe. I think this is one of the areas where architecture is going to be everything about how do we segregate data, but at the same time, how do we make all that data available and useful for the organization? And of course, the existing security tools that you have are potentially inadequate when it comes to getting the visibility, the automation, and the orchestration you need for a virtual environment or cloud-hosted environment. And I say unfortunate because in a lot of cases, the attacks, the cyber attacks on hybrid applications are going undetected as a result of not having those tools in place. So there is a huge hybrid advantage. Now you're saying, Ian, you said a lot of kind of negative things about hybrid. I just am pointing out the realities in terms of the security threat landscape and how it plays off against it. But the hybrid advantage is if you have peak loads, if you have peak periods where you don't want to have to scale to that maximum capability, the hybrid advantage of being able to put your front end somewhere that scales dramatically rather than running into physical limitations within your own on-premise infrastructure can drive down costs dramatically, okay? So this is really now understanding your infrastructure and looking at how you can scale to meet demand during peak performance. Now, that only comes into, in a lot of cases, it's exacerbated when you're looking at the e-commerce world, right? But also, it will come in to like various things that occurred, and just like we were seeing with the attack, the cyber outage, shall we call it? We don't know if it was a cyber attack, to be fair, but the outage with the FAA, the booking systems to get people rebooked, right, or the cancellation of flights during the storms will peak the front end and back end databases that deliver the booking experience, the booking system for major airlines, right? And we saw in dramatic fashion, I think it was, when Southwest fell over because clearly there was a scale issue or a demand issue that caused a major outage again. So whether or not they were in a hybrid or cloud didn't matter. The discussion is academic, and I can understand the advantage of being able to scale dramatically as required. And that's one thing that it pushes people to having different parts of their infrastructure in that cloud, which is potentially, almost free, shall we say, in terms of upward levels. And then to sort of underscore point number one, you don't know what you're doing, like this is critical in that there has to be a certain level of maturity to even start considering, a cloud or a hybrid cloud environment. There needs to be some questions around, the software development lifecycle and whether or not, this code that's being put up there isn't riddled with vulnerabilities. And again, some huge shout out to my friends who helped me out on this. Two folks that work almost every day in application security. I talked about like modern issues with the software supply chain. We saw the issues that came to head with organizations that weren't using SBOM and stuff like that. Issues around old programming languages that can sort of be more easily exploited, shall we say, than new programming languages specifically designed for the delivery of safe and secure web applications, and of course, misconfiguration of the infrastructure. And there's no better way of illustrating that misconfiguration of the infrastructure than dissecting the Log4j JNDI attack. The big issue that I've framed up here is this is essentially the same attack, if you will, as the one that exploited NetBIOS, right? The WannaCry, the double pulsar Trojan, the Eternal Blue exploit, and the resulting Petya, not Petya, and Bad Rabbit attacks. This was because the firewalls / network configurations failed to block the exfiltration of the NetBIOS protocol through 445. Here, it's kind of interesting because we have the same sort of challenge, but this time it was LDAP that was the way of getting access to the systems. And we can see in that diagram that there's a number of areas that indicated what we have some technology that we could use to block the attempted exploit, that we could patch, of course, as part of your vulnerability management, configuration management issue, disable it if you don't need it, right? Disable the ability to perform that lookup function, and disable remote code bases. I'll also say and call out lack of a content security policy also could have contributed to the ability to exploit a LDAP. So all of these things are really, really important to look at that attack surface. And I got a slide on this where it talks very much about how we need to approach application development. Now, this is why I want to call this out and drive the parallel between Eternal Blue, which exploited over 443, I think, or 445, not sure. But this was where we have, again, LDAP being available on these specific ports to make an outbound connection, right? And this is where, again, microsegmentation, which is one of the vendors we commonly work with on these shows, but isn't sponsoring this particular event. Microsegmentation and the ability to control these protocols at the edge of your network, right, become a huge security win. And that's why, in some cases, organizations that were highly vulnerable to the LDAP threat it wasn't effectively exposed. And of course, they could fix it at their leisure rather than the panic that ensued. My heart goes out to some of those hardworking people, just like my heart goes out to every Exchange admin, on-premise Exchange admin that's out there. You guys have had the shittiest year on record, I have to say. But again, what we're talking about is using secure languages. I guess I put that slide in there a second time. And right, so I've said enough on that. I just want to go quickly now into who's the owner of this argument that we get to all the time. This is where the business has to work with dev in order to get anywhere close to delivering an effective solution to the organization. This is why we've seen the rise of something called the BISO, right? And when we talk about the BISO, we're really talking about somebody that can interface and get those data requirements hammered out into an organization. And what we're doing is really talking about a way of addressing the disparities between the way development is conducted and talked about versus the way the business's expectations are. We've all seen the diagram about, the project manager thinks this and thinks that, and, the business thinks this and that, and then the poor IT guys think this and that, right? But this is expensive. This is the part where application development and hybrid cloud fails, is because folks haven't done the necessary proof of concepts and user acceptance, UAT testing, and security testing, which again are, if we want to talk about a structure of 3 pillars, we really need to have that piece in place in order for all of this to work and for the delivery of these services effectively. And then again, and this was some input from another application development expert, we really need to talk about that threat modeling, right? The secure code practices. Everyone should be sort of continuously trained. Be aware, and this is where DevSecOps and CTI really come into this. Be aware of what third-party libraries you have, how they might be exposed, right? And that's very helpful to have SAST and DAST testing, because those things alone will be able to generate that SBOM that you need in order to track down a vulnerability in a particular library that comes out, or track down, a function that shouldn't be there. And let's face it, in the case of Log4j, why would you have, which is essentially a text logging application, why would you give it the ability to pass strings? It baffles my mind, right? So it's really careful to understand what that functionality that's built in. And I remember back in the day, Zoom got in a lot of trouble because they were using a bunch of Facebook libraries, and that had all sorts of impact with a bunch of functionality that was in those libraries that they probably weren't even aware of, right? Acceptance tests on Q&A and pen tests on Q&A environments. This becomes great. So pen tests should be happening on your staging environments, assuming that staging environment is set up close enough to the actual production. I'm just going to take a sip here. Right. The timely remediation of vulnerabilities, or if the vulnerabilities cannot be remediated, understanding what the risk and the impact is, being able to detect that their exploit is coming. This is why CDNs and other technology become very important in protecting your infrastructure and lowering the price of a lot of hybrid deployments. And then, I talked about encryption, right? Now, encryption has changed a lot since the old days that we think about encryption. Now, by default, instances in your Amazon environment and into your Azure environment are going to be encrypted between those services and those instances by default, okay? Now, this does have some implications if you are terminating at a load balancer within your own organization encryption, which used to be the case in a lot of cases. And there were some compliance issues around that, but usually you could put in a compensating control. But your load balancers would terminate encryption, and then you have clear text from that load balancer back into either web infrastructure or database infrastructure, or web infrastructure and then database infrastructure, all in clear text. Now, the problem here is, if that is the way you've got the architecture running, it's probably working great. But as soon as you've decided to go to a third-party storage, for instance, of logs, if you're not encrypting the logs and you're just pushing syslog that by default is not encrypted, and you're pushing syslog up to the cloud, you better have that access security locked down, because you essentially are pushing clear text logs into a giant S3 bucket that may be globally available, right? Not a good scene at all. So again, understanding the architecture will inform the protections that you're going to need when you look at it all out on paper, right? I think that is a critical takeaway, right? Compliance, again, we talked a lot about this. But, the one takeaway, actually I've got two takeaways on this one, is that really understanding that your SIEM is for the security of the organization, or SIEM. It's not the logging solution for the business. I cannot stress this more, because the more information that doesn't have security value that's being pushed into a SIEM means your signal-to-noise ratio on trying to find something that isn't working properly becomes a very difficult task. So again, try and be judicious in deciding what is going to go into the SIEM solution in terms of like activity or alerts and stuff like that. And if you do need logging for compliance purposes, you want to have a different solution for that. And again, don't get confused. Security is not compliance, but proof of the existence of security is compliance. If you can't generate a report, as far as I'm concerned, that's a compliance failure. But even though you might have that function, then you're good to go, right? So again, don't get caught up in that double-edged sword of, it's like, hey, yeah, we have backup and restore, great, but hey, you know what? We've never tested the backup or the restore capability, right? Again, compliance fail, even though you've got that function going on in your business. Really what we're talking about now is a path forward to try and head off those security threats, because the bad guys will find the holes in your infrastructure. They will find the vulnerabilities in your applications, right? So secure software development lifecycle goes to the top, getting that training in place for developers, and cross-functionally getting some developer awareness so that they can speak the language within the security team. Again, web application vulnerability scanner is not the answer to application security. There are many things in the OWASP that a web application vulnerability scanner cannot detect, but can get you owned just as fast, right? And then this is really about a team effort. This is really, now when you're talking about hybrid, you're talking about the provider, you're talking about all the APIs, you're talking about development, you're talking about virtual networking. It all has to come together, or what you're going to have on your hands is a whole bunch of people with really, really sad faces trying to discuss how it's not their fault, okay? And I've been in those meetings myself, and those are really unpleasant places to be. So because I like to leave it on a bit of a bright note, let's check in with the CISO that everybody loves, Roy Batty, and hang on the words that he has told us in the past, where he has seen things you people wouldn't believe, dev, staging, prod, all in the same instance. I watched malicious actors destroy all three environments in moments. All the data will be lost in time like the tears of the CFO. Time to die. So let's not die in 2023. Let's do it right. Let's see what we can do here to up our game and meet the expectations of the business and meet those security requirements. All right, time for the tough questions.
Thanks, Ian. I love ending on a hopeful note there with that slide. I got a really interesting question from Dave, and I'm very curious about it as well. Dave asks, I have recently heard the term super cloud. How does security and other issues apply to the super cloud? And then everyone, for context, I just pulled up a definition of the super cloud from a Cornell University paper. I'd never heard of it before today, but Cornell University in this paper says, supercloud is a cloud architecture that enables apps migration as a service across different availability zones or cloud providers. Yeah, so Ian, what do you think of the supercloud, and how should we start preparing for security issues
you know what?
Regarding that?
The most important thing here is that this is like resiliency as a service in a lot of ways. Okay. Now, one of the key things that I know about this is really like bringing together a bunch of different multi-cloud architectures. So we talked about that. When you talk about that kind of mass deployment, right, across different zones, across maybe even different time zones to balance things out, it now becomes a huge DevSecOps tool chain and development area of focus, because these are the kind of things that you build that are absolutely massive, right? But at the same time, it's like a layer of abstraction that you may have to just trust, because some people are calling it meta cloud. I've heard that thing before. This is kind of like almost getting to function as a service, or FaaS, that I put on the chart. I think evolutionarily we're going to see this kind of thing, this architecture used in delivering the largest applications that we have that are in general containerized, and that balancing and that migration of that containers and that scaling happens almost automated, right, in the background of our infrastructure management people, right? And so I sort of think like this is like a next evolution of being able to migrate and move infrastructure at a pace that is just at a pace that we haven't really even considered before. So.
Okay. Right. All right, another question from Lee. This is kind of adjacent to the topic at hand, but also very curious to hear what you're going to say, Ian. When looking at this topic, and applying it to the security of IoT, are you addressing security at each of these levels? And the levels that he says are perception, network, and application layers.
Yeah, and the answer to that is absolutely not. It's not currently being done effectively. Where I think it breaks down is that there is the IoT devices are generally pushing data at whatever is receiving it, right? IoT devices in general are doing only a basic level of shall we say, processing of that particular data. All of the processing of what's being received, right, is then done at application layers, right, within the application to provide you with whatever picture it is. So if we use the analogy of CCTV cameras, right, the IoT device pushes that data up to the cloud where the processing and interpretation of that data is happening. All the layer, I would say, at that application layer knows is whether or not it's received data from that particular device. And it can say, oh yeah, that data is corrupt, or that data or that device hasn't checked in, right? But we have no way of going back and asking that IoT device, is it okay? Do you have a problem, right? Without sort of like another layer of like, almost we're talking about taking AI and feeding that data into it to try and get some insight into why that IoT device is now not behaving like all the other IoT's device. So the perception and anticipation of expected behavior is like a machine learning layer of abstraction that I think we're going to see more and more of applied to IoT devices in general. And we're going to be able to do that because if we're talking about 5th generation, we'll have the connectivity and bandwidth to do that. Now, where it gets interesting, though, is how are we going to protect privacy if we can extrapolate that information about the behavior of those devices? So I did a presentation just, I think, before Christmas where I talked about the ethics of, can we do this? Yes. Should we do this? Maybe not, right? So there is sort of like this area now where we're collecting a massive amount of telemetry from IoT devices and we're processing it. But I have a feeling that we're going to start sending that into machine learning models. And what comes out the bottom of that will be really, really interesting and could be an advantage, And I've seen this technology in action because some of the most sophisticated technology is out there, right? That can detect a briefcase that has been left in an art gallery, by a patron in the art gallery, and the camera notices that, hey, I've detected a briefcase and there doesn't seem to be a human close to that briefcase, and therefore it could be a threat or it could be just someone with a lost briefcase. Now, what's interesting is that the machine learning model can identify that briefcase and can possibly even match that to the person that dropped that briefcase. And so essentially their briefcase could be returned to them, right, at the front counter after being scooped up by, a security team, right? So there's these amazing things that we can do with this technology and when we put ML into these mixes. But again, we're now talking about, if we can predict the future, what does that do to individual people's rights to privacy, et cetera? So I think Lee, who's the guy that's asking these questions, is really ahead of the time here because, anyone that talks to me about SuperCloud and all of the availabilities and, like you said, abstractions is a great example, and derivatives that come out of that data is on the cutting edge of technology. So great question. I just almost we could do our own presentation on the SuperCloud.
Yeah, so look out for that summit in the future, everyone on this audience. Thanks so much, Ian. That was a great presentation, and I agree, great questions from everyone. Audience, stay tuned. We're going to take a very quick break, and we'll be back at the top of the hour for our second session called Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Security and Recovery. While you wait, take a minute to check out those resources on your console provided by Okta, Red Hat, 1111, and Metallic. And we'll be right back. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. I'm David Rammel, editor of Virtualization Cloud Review, thanking you for attending this summit and thanking our sponsors, Okta, Red Hat, 1111 Systems, and Metallic, a Commvault venture, for underwriting it and allowing us to bring you this great content. I'm moderating the second session of our summit called Best Practices for Hybrid Cloud Security and Recovery. Our speakers for this session are Dave Kawula, Managing Principal Consultant at Tricon Elite Consulting, and John O'Neill Sr., Chief Technologist at AWS Solutions. Dave is a Microsoft MVP with over 20 years of experience in the IT industry. His background includes data communications networks within multi-service environments, and he has led architecture teams for virtualization, System Center, Exchange, Active Directory, and Internet gateways. John is a chief technologist with more than 25 years in IT, having worked as a consultant, architect, executive, speaker, and author. He's been involved in multinational networking, messaging, and communications projects. He has authored material for Thomson Reuters Aspiratory books and exec blueprints, and also develops courseware for Pluralsight. Guys, it's great to have you here. Please take it away.
Awesome. Thanks for having us, David, and thanks for the warm introduction. Just a little bit of quick housekeeping. John and I like to keep our sessions super interactive, so if anybody has any questions as you're going through and listening to the topics that we're talking about today, feel free to ask questions. Just pop them into the Q&A panel. We will get to absolutely as many as possible. This is actually our first session for 2023, so this is pretty exciting to be back into the mix here again, John. And this is a pretty relevant topic, especially with some of the events that are going on today, isn't it?
Absolutely, Dave. It's exciting to get together with our fellow IT pros, and as you said, couldn't be more relevant with a cyber attack forcing Iowa's largest school district, some 30,000 plus students, to close down for at least a couple days, and really they don't know how long it's going to last because they don't know the total impact. So, as you and I are always saying, it's a heck of a lot easier to prevent than it is to fix.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully during the next hour here, we'll be able to give some really relevant tips and tricks for all of our attendees for, how they can not only secure but also protect, backup, and recover that hybrid infrastructure that they have. So let's go ahead and get started here, John. All right. Figure out my new panel. There we go. Figured out how to move the slide. Okay, so number one, John, you and I often talk about things, and, one of the big ones that, organizations often get out of hand is, the amount of, storage and the request for storage. I think we've all seen tickets coming through our service desk that say, hey, you know what, this particular virtual machine that I've got, be it a hybrid on-prem or in the cloud, it's running out of space. Can I just get another 50 gigs for it? And, normally he'll get quickly approved saying, yeah, absolutely, we got to give you 50 gigs of space, no problem. Well, in a hybrid world that we live in, we've probably got backup targets that are protecting that. We've probably got replicas for that from a DR perspective. And what is often forgotten is the impact on back-end services for just that simple request, John, like 50 gigs. Because often cases it's a lot bigger than that, especially when the file server is running out of space. Can you just throw an extra terabyte at this? And one of the big things that I want to point out here is that there's an effect that happens on that. You and I have coined this term, a cascade effect, patent pending, John O'Neill Sr. and Dave Kula. But there's upwards of a 7 to 8x multiplier on every gig or every terabyte of data. And so, why is that relevant and important for our attendees? Because from a planning perspective for the backup and DR team, that's pretty huge, isn't it, John?
Oh, it's, I don't think we can emphasize it enough. And, one of the unfortunate things is Best Buy and Office Depot, they haven't done us any favors, because what they've done is create this perception that storage is cheap. And so we've been dealing with this problem for a decade now, where everybody's like, what do you mean it's expensive? Why can't you do this? I can go to Best Buy and pick up a 1 terabyte drive for next to nothing. And I have to sit down and explain that business storage is very different from home storage or personal storage. And the way I explain it is you know what? You lose that hard drive you buy for your house, and you're annoyed. You might be downright upset. But it probably isn't going to prevent you from having enough money to pay your bills. It probably isn't going to make you have to pull your kid out of college. Whereas business class storage, when storage at a business fails and they can't necessarily produce the product or process the invoicing they need to or manage distribution, that could mean somebody getting laid off. That could mean customers, fleeing and those sorts of things. So when we talk about business grade storage and what it costs to add it, it's a whole different ballgame than what it costs you to go to Office Depot and buy a hard drive for your house. And, with that said, the way we're using it and managing it becomes important. Dave, you and I have sat, and you know how I like to call the way that a lot of the companies we deal with, the way they manage storage is like watching an episode of Hoarders. and they have, the same copy of files on 12 different PCs and 2 different file servers. Well, when you and I coined the cascade effect, we limited it to kind of the backups and the immutable backups and those kind of things. Well, that 7 times multiplier goes up exponentially as you start to encounter all those different copies that people are keeping that, you haven't combined into single instance storage or those kind of things. If I've got 12 workstations and I take 12 different backups of them and then move those backups over to different backup targets and things like that, I really can be wasting some of that very valuable, expensive storage.
Yeah, for sure. And John, we've actually got a great question already from Lee. And so the question is, how did we get to the 7x multiplier that we've calculated? And so Lee, it's actually quite simple. What we do is we take the initial amounts of storage that's typically going to be stored on some type of premium platform, probably some type of hyper-converged platform, all-flash, NVMe storage, something like that. Let's just pick a hypothetical number, that's 50 gigs or 100 gigs, whatever it is. Well, we need to back that up. So there's probably going to be an on-site copy, an off-site copy, probably a cloud copy, an immutable dark copy, and that doesn't even cover DR. From a DR perspective, we want to replicate that infrastructure over to some other gear. And so now I'm going to have a local copy, potentially a cloud, and potentially another offline copy. And that's very common for a lot of organizations to stack up copies of their backups like that. It's actually recommended by most backup vendors. So that's how we come to that calculation, and that doesn't even include all the cost of additional hardware to drive all of that as well. So
and Dave, I just want to throw in there, because you did a perfect description there. And, I like to tell people that the reason why we call it out like you did here, where the on-site, off-site, cloud, immutable is 4 times, and then the DR, because even if you're not necessarily doing like the DR replication and that sort of thing, okay, fine, take that out. You still have a pretty heavy multiplier with just the on-site, off-site, your cloud, your immutable, that kind of thing. And if you aren't doing those things, then I would suggest that you need to be pretty nervous about your ability to recover from a cybersecurity event, because the less you have in terms of those types of things, the more at risk you are. And, Dave, this is like many other things. It's kind of old things are new again. We used to have multiple copies. We would make, a backup to tape, and then we'd have a copy that we kept off-site and on-site and that kind of thing. So we've had it. It's just it's a lot deeper now and a lot more expensive now.
Yeah, absolutely, John. All right, next one here. You and I often find that organizations are recycling gear, and we were trying to be good stewards of IT for the longest time. We would take production hardware, maybe we had a fan that we were using and it had space on it, and now we have this ability to take and to back up all of our virtual workloads, either hybrid or in the cloud, and we need somewhere to stuff that. And so a lot of organizations would try to squeeze as much money out of those capital investments as they possibly could, and they would take and they would reuse that old hardware. Now, the problem is that, when you're under a cyber attack, or you've got a ransomware situation where, you've got your cyber insurance vendor involved and, everything's shut down, and now it's, you're running into problems where, those backup targets aren't actually keeping up with the restore rate that we're anticipating. My point here is, John, is that we need to make sure that we treat our backup and DR and backup hardware as production. It's not just something that sits in a closet somewhere that we're going to need to use for a rainy day. Because if you're going to take and if you're going to build infrastructure to protect key and critical infrastructure that's driving your company, you want to make sure that in the day that you have to light it up, it actually works. And so using and leveraging your old hardware is not a good idea anymore. You need to make investments into your backup and DR platforms and really treat those platforms as if they are production. Because in the event that you need to light them up, trust me, the business is not going to accept us coming back to them and saying, well, we lost half of our data because the backup storage target that we were using was kind of old, and, it wasn't really something that we had expected to keep online this long. And, I know you really want it back, but, half those backups are gone. They're not going to accept that. So, John, from a business perspective, what do we have to look at with these old backup targets? And there's actually something new for everyone for 2023, which is the cyber insurance part of this as well, and keeping old hardware around. So what are your thoughts on this, John?
Right, and I'm going to zoom right in on that insurance part of it from a business perspective, because, most businesses, most organizations, whether it be privately held, publicly held, whatever, they're not going to accept operating without business. If you've got loans and things like that, they don't want you to operate without insurance for your business, is what I meant to say, because it's too much of a risk. And your insurance company, you may not be looking at your DR as production, but your insurance company sure is. And here's why. Because you have different types of insurance, whether it be property insurance or cyber insurance, business interruption insurance, that kind of thing. And the insurance company, when they determine how much they're going to cover you for, what your retention or deductible is, what your premium costs are, they look at the total value of your assets or what it is that they're covering. They're looking at the risk of loss in the event something happens, say a cyber attack, and what it would cost to recover from that event. And if you have old hardware, they look at things such as, well, fine, you go to fire up this DR target and it doesn't want to start, but it's out of support. Who are you calling to help you get it up and running? And if it takes you an extra 2 days to find somebody and recover that and get it back up and booted, the insurance company is like, we're on the hook for that business interruption for an extra 2 days, which could have cost an extra $250,000 or something like that. And they are factoring all of that in. They're just adding it up. It's just a spreadsheet or a ledger, if you want to call it that, and they're adding it all up. So you may not think of it that way, but they are, and it shows up in whether or not you get the coverage, how much it's going to cost you, and like I said, what your limits are. So if you're not treating DR as production today, I highly suggest you get to that mindset.
Perfect. And we actually have a great question that just came in from George here that's very relevant to, backup targets. And his question was, can you go over the principal points of mutable backups? And so is it entirely dark? And so I don't know how long you've been around IT, George. John and I have been around for a long time. We were around.
Yeah, that's Dave calling me old.
Yeah, back the old tape backups. Hey, John. And so with the tape backups, we could take and we have the ability to either have a little clip on those tape backups, or we could take and pop a tab on them to make them basically read-only, so you couldn't continue to write to them. So the general principle of immutable backups is the same. It's write once and read many. And so at a software level, backup targets can actually be built so that a period of time of those backups can never be overwritten. So in the event that there is a ransom attack or something like that, or something does get access to that data, it's physically impossible to overwrite it, okay? So that's one layer of immutability. Another layer of immutability is to physically take your data off the network, have it dark, have it offline. That's another type of, offline immutability that you can have. But fantastic question. Thank you very much for that,
and
George.
Dave, if you don't mind, I'm going to jump in because I want to add for George that might help him. So, George, when you think of the word immutable, just replace that with unchanging or unchangeable. So when we create an immutable backup, like Dave described in the old days of those floppy disks when we would, cover the tab and do that kind of thing, we were creating a physical barrier to changing that data. And the reason for that is that, we didn't want anything accidental or intentional to corrupt the information as it was stored. Same thing happens today. And you have multiple layers, like Dave mentioned. You have software protection, okay, and then you have physical protection. Are you shutting the network port off so that prevents things getting through? Are you making it dark, completely disconnecting it? That sort of thing, which physically air gaps it. Those are different levels of protection against change. And, it's important to note that a couple years ago when this concept became really big, lots of people jumped in with software-based immutable solutions. Well, don't think that the cyber attackers, that the nation states that are creating attacks aren't targeting the software protections that are in place. Because remember, software is software. Of course, the developer doesn't think it's got a hole in it or a problem until after it's exploited. Well, if you're the person that got the exploit, that doesn't help you feel any better or cover your costs. So that's why Dave and I are often big fans of creating that dark copy of immutable data, completely taking it away from the possibility of someone, unless they have physical access, being able to even have a chance at changing it.
Well, and the other point to that offline immutable copy, John, is that if you are hit by ransomware, as we both know, and cyber insurance vendors get involved, they're going to want to take and have hands-off access to all of that infrastructure. Well, if you've got a dark copy that's sitting there, you could use that to start spinning up greenfield environments to gain access back to your critical data and bring your company back online, hopefully faster, while they're doing all of their forensic analysis. All right, the next one, John, traditional block storage versus object storage. So I think we've all seen an issue over the past year or two where we have had problems with procuring things from a supply chain perspective, where, Cisco switches or, your switch vendor of choice, you could be waiting over a year for that infrastructure to get in, or waiting that long for a server or infrastructure. So this just wasn't physically available to us. And so the problem that presented itself is that, okay, well, now we've got these needs of ever-growing data and protecting everything. We talked about the cascade effect, where within the cascade effect, we have to take and now protect all this data up to a 7x multiplier or more. Where is all of that going to go if I physically can't buy the storage that I need to protect this? Are we going to put it into the cloud? Are we going to use some object storage? Are we going to use a hybrid appliance that's going to connect into object storage, tier something up? What are your thoughts there, John, about, moving next generation over to, this type of object storage versus traditional block storage for the future?
Hey, thanks for throwing this over to me, Dave, because like usual, I'm sensitive to this one from looking at it through a business lens particularly. And first thing I'll say is for anybody that thinks the supply chain issues are gone, they aren't. Certainly some things are becoming more available, but as Dave mentioned just the other day, I ordered a specific model Cisco switch, and it has a 203-day lead time. So I don't know about the rest of you, but most of the projects that I'm involved in and that I have a role in, they don't have the space for a 203-day wait on a product. So keep that in mind. The other thing is that I run into a lot of users that love to tell me they need access to all their data instantaneously all the time. Because again, go back to that Office Depot or Best Buy scenario, general users think storage is cheap. They don't see the problem. And I tell them, okay, so it's cheap to build a new barn behind your house and then another one and another one, right? Well, no, but that's all different things. Not really. We have to store things and we got to have a space for it. And the object-based storage, where you say, okay, it's going to take me a little bit longer to restore it, but it's going to cost me a lot less to store it, is a great approach. And I'll give you an example, Dave, that I just ran into is actual conversation. Well, this is related to warranty, so I have to be able to pull it up right away when the customer asks me. And I said, okay, well, show me that customer agreement where they indicate that when they make a request, you have to restore it instantly. And it got really quiet. Well, I don't have that. Well, then why are you saying they insist on that? Because on the phone call, they made you think that they wanted it because they have a real patience problem? Well, an impatient person making a request is different than an actual contractual obligation. So what I'm getting at is that if you can find a way to take advantage of tiering data and create a logical approach to it, communicate it well with your user base, I am willing to bet that you will have great impact in lowering your storage cost, increasing your capability to actually process restores effectively, and ancillary benefits such as providing information when you go to get that cyber insurance renewal that helps you, again, keep the limits high and the premiums low.
Yeah, absolutely, John. So I think for a multitude of reasons, looking at object storage is something that we should all be doing from, looking at our plans for 2023 and beyond here. Okay, the next one, John, moving to a little bit more of the security focus from backup and recovery here. This is, still backup and recovery from a DR perspective, but this is kind of the pen to paper part of it. How many of us love documenting and updating our DR plans on a yearly basis? Because the reality of things is that, the world is changing so fast that to keep up with all of the attack vectors that we have to protect against from a DR perspective is very, very challenging for a lot of organizations. And the other thing is that I've come across a lot of customers and a lot of organizations that, build their DR plan once. It's very limited. It's a traditional DR plan that deals with, fire, flood, power, general maintenance issues, data center move, things like that. It doesn't deal with cyber attack. It doesn't deal with ransomware. So number one is you need more than one DR plan. You've got to figure out, what your attack vectors are and potentially have completely different plans to mitigate against that. The second thing is automating that and automating your testing that you have as you take and you go through and validate that you can fail over to your other sites. And so the big part of this is you want to make sure that you're tracking how long it actually takes to, recover some of those VMs. Because, a virtual machine, John, that's, let's say, 100 gigs in size, is going to be very different to fail over and to synchronize than something that's, 5 terabytes, 10 terabytes, 50 terabytes. You really need to plan for this. And to your point about us being IT professionals and having to deal with, data hoarding from our users, it's the better that you can clean this up, the better chance you're going to have to actually recover. Because when I have this conversation with users, and to your previous point, do you really need this data right now, or can you wait a little bit? Do you really need to keep all of this data, or can we take some of this data and archive it? That's really important, because if you keep all of your data in the same tier, you don't classify that data. And Lee actually had a question around this, around, how do you deal with like data classifications and things like that around, what it is that you're protecting? You absolutely need to pick back up this project again. And the project is this, John, for 2023 for everyone. Go back through all your file servers, data storage. I don't care if you moved it up to SharePoint. You need to really evaluate that data and see how long you really need to keep it for. If you've got, compliance reasons that state that you need to keep that for 7 to 100 years, then so be it. But not all of the data is going to be inside of that mix, right? It's kind of like the person that never cleans out their inbox and constantly wants more storage for their email accounts. That's just not going to work. We're going to have to clean that up. We're going to have to archive it. We've dealt with it for years. But what I found is that we haven't dealt with it from the application storage side and the file server storage side. So the better that you can clean up your house, the easier of a time you're going to have to rebuild it and or protect and replicate it somewhere else, and automate all the rational testing that goes along with it. So what are your thoughts here, John?
Well, so Dave, you covered that super accurately and very well. So I'm going to add just kind of a little related thing, which is if you think when a cyber attack happens, like if I came and asked you, I say, okay, cyber attack happens, you're ransomed, whatever, what are you going to do? If your answer is, well, I follow my DR plan, that's like saying, when my house burns down, what am I going to do? And I answer, call the insurance company. There's a lot more necessary to it. In fact, Dave, you and I know this, that to have a proper chance at recovery, you need not only a DR plan, but an incident response plan. You need business continuity plans. You need all those things. And just like, you talked about a per workload basis for RTO and RPO, you should have by department business continuity plans. The days of just kind of creating this business continuity plan that covers your, 2,000 employee organization and have that be effective are over. At this point, because you have different parts of your process that may be VLAN for security or isolated, separate networks, whether they be DMZs, whatever, the process to keep business up and running and making money is varied between them. So you should certainly have that planned out. And remember, a plan is only as effective as the tests you run against it. So, just like your backups, you have to be doing restores to make them valid. With your business continuity plans or your incident response plans, you need to be conducting tests of those, right, to make sure that they work. So remember that when we talk about recovery plans, you have the DR, you have the incident response, you have the business continuity, and whatever else is required to appropriately keep impact low on your organization and protection high.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much, John. I've got a simple question for you, this one on this topic. We won't spend a ton of time on this because we talked a little bit about the immutability and dark copies earlier, but my question to you is this. John, do threat actors actively target backup and replica environments?
That's like saying, do I need air to live? They absolutely do. There's no doubt.
Absolutely. And so one of the big pieces here for everyone listening is that, threat actors, when they're taking and, reconning your infrastructure, they are looking for your backup targets. They are looking for, low security that's been configured on these things. If they can take and get a hold of them prior to launching, for example, a strike where they're going to deliver a ransomware payload, what can end up happening is they'll go through and they'll try to wipe as many of these backup targets as they can because it limits your chance of recovery, right? And just when you think that's not enough and you're saying, okay, listen, we protected all the backup targets, we can recover, we can survive a ransomware attack, now they'll just upload your data and they'll say, listen, that's really good that you're going to restore your data, but now we're just going to release this on the dark web and we're going to sell this to the highest bidder, all of this information. So, I think the big piece of securing your infrastructure and the data and your so-called, crown jewels of your infrastructure, you need to think about these pieces of, what happens if these get out into the wrong hands and how are we going to potentially deal with it? Because if you think that you have the ability to just, pull up the checkbook and write a check for whatever they want to make them not do that, that's not really even allowed anymore, is it, John?
Well, certainly not. If the organization attacking you is on a terror watch list and you're in the U.S., for instance, there are real specific laws around what you're allowed to do in terms of interacting with them and whatnot. And, it's just like other laws. It really doesn't matter what your motivation is. If you break the law, you break the law. Dave, on this point, just quickly, this is pretty straightforward why attackers would do this, whether it be attackers that are motivated for monetary gain or, gaining access to intellectual property. They don't want you to be able to restore from a backup because then you're not going to pay them or they may not get all the information they want. Or let's say it's a nation-state-sponsored cyber warfare event where really they just want to disrupt your business. Well, if you can quickly recover from a DR system, you're not as disrupted as they want. They want you to be as disrupted for as long as possible and as much as possible. So they consider targeting and eliminating, corrupting your backups, your DR systems as a high priority, high value exercise when it comes to cyber attacks.
Yeah, absolutely, John. All right, so now we're working through the process. We're cleaning up our infrastructure. We're saying, hey, listen, you know what? We've got cyber insurance. One of the things that you have to do, and you learn this word very well when you're dealing with insurance vendors, especially when it comes to cyber insurance vendors, is attestation. So, John, what is attestation, and why is this important for everyone? Because I have personally witnessed organizations and managers just basically sign whatever forms are put in front of them from the cyber insurance vendors that says, are you protected on everything by multi-factor authentication, on all VPN endpoints, on all out-of-band networks for IPMI or DRAC or anything like that? Are you protected there? And they'll just sign off on that form. Well, what does that actually mean? Like, you're basically forging insurance at that point in time, and it's not worth the paper that it's written on. You're just paying the premiums. But we've both seen this. So, what does this mean for those that have to go through that attestation process, and should they be taking it a lot more seriously?
Okay, so I'm gonna describe it in an analogy before I define it. For anybody that's listening that has children, maybe at some point when they were teenagers and they got their license and they were getting ready to go to the prom or out on a date or whatever, you looked at them and said, hey, swear to me you won't drink. And they said, I'm not going to drink. We're just going out to have a good time. Well, they're attesting to the fact that they're not going to drink. Now, if they don't live up to that, you can just imagine the bad things that come from that failure to live up to the attestation. Same thing with insurance. So the insurance company comes to you and says, hey, you need to attest to the fact that you have MFA on all your admin accounts, that you have MFA on your infrastructure, that you have MFA on your VPN connections, whatever it may be. They're going to ask you to attest to those things, and you're going to answer, and they're going to require nothing more of you. Okay? No different than when you get car insurance. They ask you the question, well, do you have an anti-theft device? You say yes. Well, now let's jump forward. You got that insurance, that car insurance, and your car gets stolen. And you make an insurance claim, and they find out that you lied. You didn't have an anti-theft device. You can probably figure out what's going to happen with your insurance claim. Same deal with cyber insurance. You said, I have MFA on everything. You make an insurance claim. They come in, because this is the point where they come in, and they look and they go, wait a minute, there was no MFA on any of this stuff. Think about where your insurance claim is going to go. What are they going to pay out? And to the point you made, Dave, if your goal was simply getting a policy and making yourself feel better that you have insurance and being able to report to the board or to whoever that, yeah, we have insurance now, we paid $250,000 for it. If that was your goal, then you accomplished it. But if your goal was actually obtaining insurance that is going to help make you whole again if you have an incident, then don't just attest to something. Make sure you're doing your own audits to ensure that it is true and accurate. Because when you do that, even if you just check all the boxes and submit the form and say, yep, I have everything. As you mentioned, Dave, that's technically insurance fraud because you're lying, you know better on an insurance application. Do I think that they're going to, sue you or send you to jail or whatever? No, I don't. But I think they're not going to do anything to help make you whole when you need it most, right? When you're trying to save your fellow employees' jobs or save your company from going under, that's a big deal. And I will say that there are some industries where the cyber attack success rate in them is such that 80% of those that are successfully attacked don't recover. They go out of business, meaning everybody that's employed doesn't have a job anymore. So I'll stop my soapbox on that, but hopefully that gives everybody the 411 on what attestation is and why it is so important to not just take the easy route and check the boxes, but to actually do what you say you're going to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, we've actually got a really great question that just came in from George. And the question is, John, as a technical writer, I have a lot of interest in writing risk management plans for corporations. They provide both ransomware, provide support for both ransomware incidences and other security concerns. Do you agree that you should extend those plans out beyond just traditional builds? And we were kind of talking a little bit about this in the multiple VR plans. But for the risk management plans, do you think risk management plans should be split off like that as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's a core part. And thank you, George, for bringing that forward. Because, let's think about that from the point you put it forward. Like, okay, I'm doing this for the business, for the organization, for the board of directors, the C-suite, whatever it is. Well, I want you to think about something. Those groups look at project plans all the time. I don't care whether it's a project plan related to IT or implementing a new machine out on a plant floor or whatever it is. When they look at project plans, most good PMPs will tell you that a part of a good project plan is the risk register or the risk evaluation for what will tank the project, what will make it cost more, or that kind of thing. So if the C-suite and the board of directors and the organization considers risk analysis, risk management of basic projects important, it's just common sense in my mind that they would absolutely consider risk management of their cyber infrastructure, something that could literally cost them the farm if they don't take it into account. And so, sometimes when I've been in there with corporations and they're like, okay, well, great, thanks for preparing this risk plan for me, this risk management plan. But why should I really be concerned about it? I ask them, well, do you worry about when you buy that $2 million piece of machinery about understanding what the risks are to having it successfully implemented? And they say, of course I do. And I say, well, you have a $10 million cyber infrastructure, and these are the risks associated with that and how we're going to mitigate and manage them. So thanks for bringing that forward, George. That's an awesome point, and I'm glad to hear you're doing that.
Yeah, for sure. All right. So the next one I wanted to talk about was to the points that we had earlier. And once again, we won't spend a ton of time on this one, but different layers of immutability, because not everyone has maybe they don't have the budget right now just because the way the economy is shaking up to maybe go ahead and buy brand new infrastructure, even although we're recommending that, go spend money on backup, spend money on VR. What if we can't, John? What are some of the options that we have for, layers of immutability that we can build to protect ourselves and our most critical assets that we have from an IT infrastructure perspective? Is it a reality for us to, maybe take one of those older backup targets, control switch port access to it, not leave it on the network, only bring it on the network for a period of time where we've got to seed the backups and, process those incrementals over there? Should we have dark backups? Maybe you're a smaller organization, John, and your entire company can fit on, an 18 terabyte external USB disk. Should we put that into a safe somewhere the same way that we would treat offsite tape backups? Is this a reality? Like, are there still things that, individuals and us in IT can do, even although, maybe economy is shrinking and maybe our budgets are going down a little bit? Can we do this a little bit on the cheap?
Absolutely. You just need to be creative. Define your goal and then open yourself up to brainstorming. I remember when I was a kid in high school in English class, and we would have to write stories or research papers, right? They taught us to start with a blank sheet of paper and just kind of open up your mind and write down whatever comes to your mind. No filter, no nothing. And that's what I tell people to do when they think about solving their cyber insurance problems. And yes, before Dave brings it up, me in high school was a long time ago, although I will tell everybody that fire had been invented by then, so that was a good thing. Back to the point at hand, the creative part of this solution, Dave, that I see is that, by taking them off and controlling when they're on the network and off the network, that not only gives you the ability to take advantage of some older, lower cost hardware, but also still remain in compliance with your cyber insurance or your auditors. Because I've seen some of them that are getting absolutely technically unreasonable in terms of the things that they don't want connected to your live network for them to be satisfied. Well, guess what? It's not connected on your live network if you're doing this, except for these very short periods of time, and you simply define them. You audit them to say, yeah, I have actually audited this, and the backup takes exactly 3.6 hours to run, and we enabled the port 2 minutes before it started and 2 minutes after it ended, so the total window of time that it was open to the network was this. We can control that, we audit it, and every insurance company and auditor I've dealt with to this point accepts that because it is beyond what the average person is doing. And my experience is if you can show that you are doing beyond what other organizations are doing, you will become their favorite client, their favorite customer, even if you aren't meeting everything they wrote down on the piece of paper.
Awesome. Okay, next one here, John. The human factor. This one's huge because in the state of the world that we live in right now, attacks might not come in from the vectors that you might think. You might lock down the outside of your network. You might put an intrusion detection system. You might put advanced threat protection on your endpoints. You might use multi-factor authentication. We might use all of these things to prevent these attacks coming in from the outside in. But what happens when the attack comes from the inside out, John? Have you seen situations where, we might have some disgruntled IT pros that have elevated credentials that might be looking to sell those credentials on the dark web? Well, guess what? They've already got access through MFA. They've got access to key and critical systems. How do you protect in that situation, John? Because it's not all sunshine and roses and rainbows when it comes time to operating a business. There's an upturn, there's a downturn, and that's kind of the tough part about having to deal with this in IT, because we are, for all intensive purposes, given the keys to the kingdom from an infrastructure perspective when we work in IT. What happens when one of those resources goes rogue? What can we potentially do to protect against that?
Well, and Dave, and I'm going to be quick because I know we have so much content here for everybody, but I'm so glad that we have this slide in here because, the human factor is a key point of risk for businesses to consider, insurance companies, that sort of thing. We talked about it earlier about how insurance companies look at the risk of, say, unsupported hardware and why that increases costs and things like that. Well, they absolutely look at human factors in the same way. Now, they may not have as much weight, but they certainly do have weight and bearing. And what do I mean by that? I mean that if, let's say that they are, insuring you for, a certain amount on your cyber insurance, and that's based on your DR plan, they're looking also at the human factor of your DR administrator, right? What are they supposed to be doing every day? Are they validating those restores? I mentioned that earlier, and everybody kind of knows that if you haven't tested your backups, you don't have any backups. We've been saying that for years. Well, what about the person that's responsible for that? And how are you auditing that they're actually doing that and that kind of thing? Trust me, that all weighs into it. And the more of that you have, the more risk the human factor introduces. Maybe you have an automated access control system that gives people physical access through gates or that sort of thing, but it depends on an HR teammate actually going in and checking a box that says disable this badge or whatnot. Well, what if the human doesn't check the box? The badge doesn't get disabled and they can get in the building, and that's a risk. So all those things are put into play, and I know I kind of took it off a little bit more, but I thought you did a great job talking about it. I just want people to realize that it's easy for us to get caught up in the ones and zeros, bits and bytes, the hardware, the physical things. but the human factor is more critical to our success than it ever has been.
Awesome, John. Okay, we've got a couple more points here, and then we'll wrap it up for our wonderful next presenters that are coming up in behind us. This one here I won't spend a ton of time on, but I really did want to bring this up. And from a cyber insurance perspective, I know it's a bit of an issue keeping out of warranty hardware around. But one of the things that I do highly recommend for organizations right now, and I've physically seen this, we've done so many ransomware recoveries over the last 3 years, John, that part of that process is typically having to rebuild and or respin up a greenfield environment to try to get key business systems online, like payroll, accounting. We've got to make sure that our invoices are going out to the clients. We've got to make sure that products are getting shipped. There's a key system that needs to come back online and recovered. Well, if everything is ransomed and you're locked out and the cyber insurance vendor won't let you get back in there, where are you going to restore to? You need something, somewhere to restore this to. And even although that gear was replaced in the last couple of years, it ran production for the 5 years prior to that. It might not be as fast, but you do have the ability to potentially get yourself back up and running. For a lot of us, in our organizations, we have warehouse space inside of our buildings where we can store this old gear. I recommend hold on to that for a little while because supply chain's still not good, as we were mentioning, John. And if you just have that in your back pocket with some extra switches, some extra hardware, you don't have to run all of your infrastructure that you had. But if you can get those 30 or 40 virtual machines that are so paramount and critical to your business back up and running, and you get them back up and running a lot faster, nobody's going to care where you're running that. Okay, and so that's my point. If you do have the budget, we've actually seen discounts in cyber insurance, John, where organizations have made the investment and they've purchased hot standby gear for the whole purpose that if there is some type of an event, we actually have hot standby gear sitting in a box. I'm not waiting 6 months for supply chain. I already have it in inventory. Yes, there's a cost to that, but you're almost self-insuring at that point in time. All right, the last one here, John, I'm going to give to you. Our backup and DR infrastructure. Do you believe, John, that it's a good idea to look at red teaming your DR and backup environments? For example, if you built a fabric to protect that infrastructure, do you believe that it's a good idea to be testing that, pen testing it, security auditing that the same way that you would as production, and the same thing for your backup artifacts in the cloud? Should we be doing security tests against that to make sure that it's viable?
Absolutely. It goes back to what I mentioned earlier. If you're not testing it, it doesn't exist, right? And another saying that I've heard over the years is if it's not documented, it didn't happen. Same kind of thing here. And I can't tell you how valuable it is to be able to prove the level of effort you're putting into doing these tests and these architectures, these extra designs, when it comes to reducing your premiums and keeping your policy limits high. So it adds value directly in that manner. And it's like the last slide where you mentioned, part of our rapidly deployable secure network, RDSN design, is that we can create up a completely air-gapped standalone greenfield network to bring an organization some functionality back while they're dealing with a cyber incident or ransomware incident. And, one of the key parts of that is because it is completely air-gapped from the primary production network and that sort of thing, it has, in every test I've put it against every carrier, it meets their requirements. It doesn't violate anything. Whereas, plugging it into the live network, they take some issue with that, and they may not, they may take longer to pay or that sort of thing, pay out and that sort of issue that you may have. That doesn't exist if you're using it in the proper way. So as I mentioned earlier, be creative, think it through, and use use those muscles you've been building all these years as IT pros and start flexing them and showing how you can really add that value and save your organizations not just money, but possibly all those ancillary impacts, people being sent home without pay, all that kind of stuff.
Well, awesome. Thank you very much, John, for your time today. It's been awesome, as always, to be able to co-present these with you. And with that, we are going to hand it back over to David Rammel. And thanks, everyone, for attending, and enjoy the rest of the show.